effort over the Welcome again. Just introducing the session for today. I was just saying that Cordula and I and all of our contributors have been laboring and collaborating together over the past 2 years to get this important volume into publication. It's been a labor of love, and we're celebrating today its publication and want to highlight what this volume is bringing to the conversation around trauma responsive peace building and related topics of mental health and psychosocial support in conflict and crisis affected settings and in longer term intergenerational contexts of protracted and intergenerational conflict and what this means for peace building in today's world. And we'll start with some brief introductions. I'm CLARKE-HABIBI, one of the co-editors of the volume. I'm honored to have been part of this process. I have been delighted to collaborate with Cordula and all of the contributors, and we're looking forward to a rich exchange today as well. I'll pass over to Cordula to introduce herself.
Yeah, good afternoon and warm welcome to all of you. Particular warm welcome to my husband. I'm very happy, Danny, to see you. Hello, hello. And I'm very happy to see so many friends and colleagues and all the wonderful people we work with, Sarah and I. As Sarah said, it was a labor of love. It was, and as we all know, love can be sometimes also quite demanding on different levels. But it was a very rich learning curve for Sarah and me, and we're very delighted to celebrate with you today. And last night I had dinner with a friend, and she asked me if you had to think of a metaphor for this whole process of writing this book, co-editing it together with Sarah. What kind of metaphor would come to your mind? And I didn't have to think too long, and I thought it was a bit like being pregnant. But not for 9 months, but for nearly 2.5, 3 years. And as we all know, for pregnancy, it takes more than two people, usually. And we have here this amazing, in a way, setup of colleagues, friends, authors who made all that happen, what we are celebrating today. So again, a very big thank you to all of you, not only for being here, but also being part of that process and being part of that pregnancy. And Sarah and I thought to make it a little bit more inspiring and entertaining for all of you, this book launch, not only for us and the contributors, we thought we would like a little bit of an interview to somehow get us into the book and the rich I think case studies we actually pulled together, the inspiring conceptual maybe thinking we try to put forward. So Sarah, I would like to ask you, what was actually your motivation to actually co-edit that book or to bring that book to life? Sarah.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, as we mentioned in the introduction to the book or the preface to the book, in fact, the idea for the book itself came more than 10 years ago. And for those of you who are in the field of trauma-related work, you'll know that that was a very early wish, because the whole field around mental health and psychosocial support has gained enormous momentum, but it's still relatively young. And so it was early days in the peace building arena that, and related to my own work and Cordula's work, that we recognized that this was a really important missing link in the conversation. There had been, of course, significant work in the area of individual and intergenerational trauma in the field of psychology and social psychology. Those of us who are in this field know the names that have led the work over several decades in the area of individual and collective trauma. But there wasn't a dialogue between those who were trauma specialists and those who were trying through various means and mechanisms to promote meaningful and sustainable conflict transformation and peace building. And so those of us who were working directly in the field at that time were seeing realities on the ground, that there are other factors at play, not just political conversations. There are human conversations there are other dimensions at both the individual and collective level that affect this work that aren't being taken into account. So Cordula and I met around the idea of this book. You may be surprised, we've never met in person. It was a meeting of hearts and minds around the need for this conversation to be brought forward, to expose how individual and collective trauma are significant factors in the recurrence of conflict and violence and in the effectiveness of peace building. We felt very strongly that trauma awareness needed to be integrated into the way that we conceptualize peace and the way that we work as organizations, as teams, as individuals, with communities, with ourselves, indeed. And we felt very strongly that this is the next wave of learning that we all need to undertake. And of course, in the meantime, MHPSS has come forward as a significant area of programmatic engagement, and it's becoming more and more specialized by the day. But one of the things that we wanted to contribute with this volume is an awareness that MHPSS speaks to a particular place and time at the moment in how we engage with conflict and crisis settings. And around that, there's also this longer term, wider, deeper understanding of collective and historical trauma and how this continues to play out in intergroup, intergenerational relations, structural features of society, collective narratives, collective identities that has yet to be taken up. So while our book publication process has taken a while, that's a publication choice, the conversation remains very relevant, and you'll find, we hope, a way to enrich our current understanding and our current discussion of these topics through the different sections of the book, which we will highlight in today's launch event. That's probably the main motivations that we had. And then, of course, secondary to that, but primary as well, I could say, is that we also felt that no one contribution could represent the richness of this field and the learning that's taking place. And therefore, a collective volume of this kind was really needed in order to expose and explore the different facets of methodologies, of conflict contexts, of different perspectives from policy and practice. It was only in bringing together this rich collection of authors who are themselves practitioners in the field that we felt that we could do justice to this very important topic. So thank you, all of you who have supported this work in one way or another and who are carrying it forward in your own organizations and your own work. I'll pass over to Cordula by asking her, my dear co-editor, in all of this work, this collective pregnancy that we have carried forward to this day. What are you particularly proud of with this book and with the process that we undertook to bring it to this stage?
Well, I mean, if you allow me to continue with the metaphor of the pregnancy, I'm happy that the baby is out. In the sense of there were some hiccups during the pregnancy, but now the baby is there, and I really want to touch it. I want to hold it. I want to play with it in terms of using all the information which it allows us to actually bring into the world. And I think more specifically, what I'm maybe very grateful, not so sure if proud is the right word, but what I'm definitely very grateful is, and you already touched upon that, Sarah, is this amazing or great diversity of perspectives and backgrounds and disciplines which we try to pull together. And also the great geographical variety and diversity. We have case studies from Canada, the United States, Colombia, to Germany, Bosnia, Ukraine, Nepal, Kashmir, Korea, from South Africa to over to Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Central African Republic, Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Iraq to Northern Ireland. And that is, I think, something which I think was only possible because we had this amazing set of wonderful authors and contributors and their particular rich backgrounds and experiences. So that is something which I think I'm particularly grateful for. And what I'm also grateful for is that we try to offer, yeah, a little bit of a bridge between disciplines and practices, and trying really to move beyond what we so often call this silo thinking. So what we actually want to show also with that book, how we can actually combine inspiring conceptual thinking, empirical research, and very different methods and approaches. Just to give you an example, there's a case study looking at multi-stakeholder processes in Rwanda from our Interpeace colleagues using randomized control trials. And then we have a very different case study from our dear friend Eva looking at more embodied approaches in the context of transgenerational and collective trauma in Israel-Palestine. And I think this, again, this bridge building of disciplines is something I'm particularly happy and grateful for. I think these are maybe the main points. Sarah, if you allow me then to continue with that, what is actually the book all about in terms of the actual content? What are we talking about in terms of chapters and the main essence of the book?
Thanks, Cordula. I think there are a couple more people in the waiting room. I'll just admit those. And also, before I launch into that, I will also turn the question that we just addressed with Cordula also to our contributors who are in the room. Maybe each of you could also add a line in the chat about what motivated you to contribute to this book and what you're proud of. We want to, Cordula and I, make sure that also our contributors are able to share their own experience of working on this content and putting together this volume. So please do add that to the chat as well. And then I will gradually shift over here. In the meantime, I'll share my screen so we can look at the table of contents. But while I'm doing that, please share what are you proud of with your contribution to this volume? What were some of the key moments of meaning making for you as you prepared your chapters and shared the work that you are doing in this field? And we'll come back to look at those contributions in the chat. I'm sharing with you now I hope you can see that. This is the webpage of Routledge, which gives the table of contents. And at the end of the session, Cordula and I will share with the participants who are here today a PDF which gives the first opening chapters, the table of contents, the forward preface, and the first opening chapter of the volume that you'll be able to take away. And that will give a deeper insight into what the book addresses. But essentially, the book is in 5 parts. So the basic structure, part 1, contributes a number of chapters around the notion of trauma. What do we mean by individual and collective trauma in context of violent conflict and peace building? And we specify that, of course, because there are many different types of trauma, and we won't go into the details of that today, but what does it mean in relation to being a source of conflict and also a basis for peace building? And how do the dynamics of individual and collective trauma express themselves in different settings? So this section offers a number of perspectives on the psychological and the psychosocial dimensions of individual and collective trauma, how it can affect conflict dynamics, how it can affect our engagement as conflict and peace-building actors, how it can affect narratives and identities that shape the way that we understand our collective histories and relationships with others in conflict settings, how we can also begin to transform these narratives without overlooking the importance of trauma, but finding ways to work with it as a means for conflict transformation and peace building. And there are several case studies in this first section, which look at context, Israel as well, and Palestine, and Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, which enable us to understand the way that trauma can recur and reshape the way that we're engaging in longer term processes of peace building. And there are some very interesting insights as well around the needs and experiences of both perpetrators and victims of violence, and how trauma affects both of these groups of actors. And I don't want to make distinct binaries. There's a lot of nuance in that whole conversation, but how participation in and being a victim of violent conflict creates different sets of needs that we haven't yet fully explored in the peace building field. And there are some really valuable insights there about what this can mean for methodologies for transformation. In the second part of the book, we move then more into understanding what resilience and healing look like in trauma-affected contexts, and what resilience and healing, what role they play in transforming violent conflicts and promoting peace. So here again, we have some theoretical foundations of what do we mean by these terms. And then we also move into case studies that explore the dynamics of resilience and healing, and a range of methodologies for fostering resilience and healing. So again, we have case studies from Palestine and Israel. We have an exploration of embodied approaches and arts-based approaches in several case studies here as well in Korea and the US. We have also a case study around longer-term collective resilience, immediately and longer-term resilience in the Beslan community, and understanding as well what shapes resilience and healing can take, and lessons can be drawn from Bosnia and Herzegovina and from trauma and resilience education in the US and in Kenya. In the third part of the book, we move more squarely into the area of mental health and psychosocial support in crisis settings. And there's been a lot of work and evolution in the MHPSS field, which of course, as everyone knows, started principally in the humanitarian sector and has gradually been articulated for different communities in the development sector, in the peace building sector, and even in the security sector. And understanding how mental health and psychosocial support is something which ought to be integrated in all of our program engagement, but also needs to be integrated in the ways that we work and the ways that we care for each other as peace building practitioners. So we have case studies that explore the what and the how and the where, and the different methodologies in Ukraine, around playback theater, for example, in northern Syria, in Afghanistan, in Central African Republic, and connecting with some important additional thematics around gender, around facilitation, and around institutional duty of care. So the third section offers a deep dive into the mental health and psychosocial support aspect. We move then from what is not only a short term, but can be more of a shorter term focus, into more of a longer term and intergenerational focus in part 4. And this is where we look at collective trauma and its intergenerational and structural and political and social and psychosocial dimensions in cases of protracted and long-term conflict, such as in Lebanon, such as in Syria, in the Caucasus, Nepal and Iraq, Colombia, Rwanda, Kenya. And here we're looking at the collective dimensions that touch on identity, that touch on history, that touch on transitional justice, that touch on memory, that touch on collective responses to gross human rights violations, and how we engage in educational processes to shift our understanding and shift these narratives and shift the collective dimensions of the longer term effects of collective trauma. And there are some wonderful case studies around constructive engagement with various stakeholders, with youth, with educational processes, with truth and reconciliation processes and mediation processes that highlight these dynamics. And last but certainly not least, part 5 of the book engages in critical questions that really need to be in every aspect of the work that we're doing. We would, and we have, to the extent possible as well, carried this critical self-reflective view as well throughout the book. But here there's also a special section dedicated to deconstructing and decolonizing our very notions of trauma and peace-building practice. What are the categories that we're bringing to these terminologies, to these conversations? What are the assumptions that we're making, and where might we be blind to imposing our own notions to the detriment of localized and culturally situated and more nuanced approaches to trauma recovery, resilience, and healing. So here we have really wonderful contributions around conflict contexts where there's more political and critical engagement with the very notion of how we work with trauma-affected communities and how we contribute to a wider global conversation in Kashmir, with Indigenous communities in Canada, and looking forward. Each of these 5 sections starts with an introduction written by Cordula and myself, and each of the contributors highlight key takeaways for peace-building practice and practitioners as they finalize their chapters. So it's not a theoretical engagement only, it's very much a practice focus, and we think that you'll find a lot of meaningful case studies, tools, methodologies, and insights in this collection. And as I said, we will send you the handout of the table of contents and the opening chapter. So, Cordula, this was a quick flyover of what ultimately was the collection of chapters that we gathered for this volume. And it must be said, of course, that when we made the call for the volume, there was an enormous response. There were more than double the number of proposals for chapters than we ultimately accepted. And it's important to acknowledge what our choices were when we put together this particular collection. We wanted to ensure global representation to the extent possible. We wanted to ensure practitioner perspectives and theoretical perspectives. We wanted to represent critical views. We wanted to reflect different stages of the conflict cycle and understanding what different dimensions of peace building come into play. Cordula and I, it should be said, framed the whole volume around what we have named the trauma awareness spectrum, and how organizations take into account trauma indirectly and more directly in the way that they work and in what they work on. But it should also be acknowledged that there were a lot of contributions either that we couldn't accept because it would have given a geopolitical imbalance in the ultimate collection of the volume, but also that working on the chapters was not an academic exercise for our contributors. It was their day-to-day work, it was their lived experience. And here, the whole process of putting together the volume itself had to be trauma-informed. We ourselves and all of our contributors, many of whom are living in active conflict contexts, have had to grapple with their own experiences of trauma, with the ongoing fragility and vulnerability of the populations that they work with. Some of the potential contributors to the volume had to pull out because they were overwhelmed by their own contexts and the other energies that they needed to dedicate. And others we're able to engage in parallel and so on. So, and we must also acknowledge that, as we said at the beginning, the volume has been 2 years and a bit in preparation, and no one needs to say more how the world has changed radically in only a few months, and certainly over the last 2 years. And so it's with a little bit of regret that there are more recent, there's more recent conflict context and also more recent conversations that may not be captured in this particular volume, but we have been able to capture these developments in the preface of the volume, which you'll receive today. And we've been able to flag horizons that we believe are as important today as ever before in the chapters and in the conclusions of the volume. So, Cordula, what can we say for the audience that have come to join us today about some of the main takeaways of this volume? What distinguishes this volume? What are some of the key insights that this volume can offer? And I also invite our contributors who are in the audience participating today to also add some of the key takeaways that you would like today's participants to be aware of. Over to you, Cordula.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And again, warm welcome to all of you, to all our dear friends and colleagues who just joined us. Of course, there are many takeaways. To me personally, also reflecting on the sort of main messages we want to send. And again, Sarah and I, of course, in the last couple of weeks, months, reread the book. I stopped counting how many times. And I think if I had to really prioritize maybe 3 main messages, that would be the ones. The first one for me is that trauma dynamics are core causes and drivers and effects of violent conflict. This is a sort of main overarching kind of message. And what do we mean by that? I think Sarah and I and all the others authors show through the different case studies, through the different kind of conceptual underpinning how unresolved trauma, especially collective and intergenerational trauma, can and very often does fuel cycles of violence, cycles of shame, cycles of fear, mistrust, guilt, and revenge narratives, and making sustainable peace actually very, very difficult to achieve. And here, particularly, I would refer to the whole first part and the first chapters of that part, written by Sarah, myself, and other colleagues in the later part of the book, like, for instance, Eva working on Israel-Palestine, or Jenny and Soher on Lebanon. So that's my sort of first main, maybe, takeaway from our book. The second one, very much related to the first one, is, and I think it won't surprise you, that we argue very strongly that peace building as a discipline or field of practice, and we as peace building practitioners, or we peace builders as a field of collective practice, we must be trauma aware if we want to be effective. And I think throughout the book we argue that peace builders need trauma awareness as an ethical and a strategic imperative. And we show, or try to show through the different case studies, how important that trauma awareness is, not only in terms of effectiveness, but also to prevent re-traumatization, to enable and support genuine intra-party and inter-party reconciliation, and to enable systemic and justice-oriented change. So that's my sort of second takeaway or main message of our book. And then the last one, very much relating to the final part of the book, is that I think reflexivity and positionality in peace building matters. And I think it matters maybe more than we have been actually willing to admit. So I also would like to understand our book as an invitation to all of us working in peace building, to the practitioners and scholars alike, to engage more rigorously in self-reflection. Why are we doing the work we are doing? what is maybe a certain maybe family background? Why are we drawn to the topics of violent conflict and violence? Maybe it has something to do with my family background. Maybe I'm acting out something which actually has very personally something to do with me, which I'm acting out on a sort of more macro level. And I think this self-reflection for me also, of course, includes an emotional awareness of self-regulation and ethical engagement. And yeah, also a willingness to recognize our own positionality and biases when working in conflict contexts in our own societies. Ada and I have a chapter there in the final part, which we're trying to, in a way, as I think Ada, we put it, to shake up our own foundations and to quickly reflect on these foundations, which also, allowed many of us to have a certain career, to be also reflective of that, and then to say, okay, what are maybe some underlying power hierarchies which we have to change if we really want to walk the talk in terms of delivering sustainable peace. And this, of course, implies the decolonization of the whole trauma and peace building practice, I think, which we just basically started. And we would also like to show in the book that it's essential that we actually critically reflect on these Western, very often still biomedical approaches, very often individualistic approaches of trauma, and that these very often were coming in the form of marginalizing or sidelining indigenous and very often relational, more spiritual healing traditions. So this reflexivity and the positionality is for me the third in a way, main message of our book. And looking at the chats, I see that there are some other important messages, which maybe we come back to when we come to the Q&A. Because what Sarah and I now try to offer you is a tour de table of our essence of the book, of some of the case studies and some of the key takeaway messages. And now we're curious to learn what are maybe your questions you may have to our dear authors, to Sarah and myself, and maybe to everyone in the room.
So we'd be curious perhaps to know how this articulates with the work that you're doing or with the challenges that you may be facing and or with any curiosity that you have about how things are approached in the book. Feel free to raise your hand and to join in the space or to put a comment or a question in the chat. We'll have some time, about 10 minutes for Q&A and exchange. And then we'll give some more practical details about how to access the book and next steps. Thank you. So there's already one comment here. I'd love to know your reflections on how to bridge from peace building as practice to practices of depolarization. Okay. Sarah, would you like to say a bit more?
Thanks. So I'm new to the peace building space. My background is more in working with around kind of depolarization and advocacy and political shifts around social justice. So I'm fascinated to hear more about how you mentioned about bridging and creating dialogue between silos. And I'm very curious to hear whether you feel what would be like the ways that we could take these important insights from the huge diversity of contributors that have made this work so rich into the conversation that's happening about, for example, how to tackle political the rise of the political far right. So it's a big question, and I want to make sure contributors from other places get a chance to share that. So don't feel you have to answer it now, but that's what I'm bringing to this conversation.
Fantastic. That's a great question. We can open it up to some of our other contributors if they'd like to share their reflections on the important question that Sarah has raised about how to connect with social justice issues and with other political processes.
And maybe
I can
why
say
would
perhaps until we see a hand come up that one of the assumptions.
Sarah, sorry.
Yes,
We
right.
have Sandra.
One of the.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
Sandra, please.
Hi, first of all, Sarah and Cordula, thank you so much for this really precious handbook. Really looking forward to diving into all the various cases, if you will. Really looking forward to learning. I'm just wondering if you might share with us a tiny bit more about some of the tips, methodologies, tools which were revealed from your research relating to how it is that one can actually help people to heal from trauma in places where there really is no, if you will, direct infrastructure, no, let's call it culture of psychosocial trauma healing, just some gems, if you will. Thanks.
Sarah, shall we collect maybe some questions? And then
Yeah, we have now 3. Celine has also raised her hand, so maybe we can hear a 4th one. Over to you, Celine.
Hello. So first of all, thank you. I'm so excited to be here and looking forward to read the book. I think one of the major questions I have in general when we talk about collective trauma, as opposed to individual trauma, where perhaps someone might go see a practitioner to work on it. And when we talk about collective trauma, and peace processes and peace building, we might work and engage with individuals who have not necessarily signed up to work on trauma, but to work on, let's say, the conflict or social tension, and they might not necessarily, make the link. And so I'm interested in your book and in the different contributions that you have, how you tackle that question of the situations where collective trauma is impacting the situation, but it might not be aware, or it might be not welcome to be put in the center. So,
Precisely.
yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, those are great questions. Maybe we can have a short intervention to address them. I'll say perhaps just 2 words, and then I'll see if Cordula or other contributors would like to add some more. So on the first set of questions, one of the perspectives that is reflected throughout the volume is that trauma is political and structural. It's not just psychological. There is a direct link and multi-dimensional interaction between collective trauma, certainly, and structural issues of inequality, of racism, of colonialism, of violence. There are systemic legacies of historical traumas that play out every day in many of our societies. And the link to that historical trauma is not always acknowledged. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it underpins the self-narratives, it underpins the group narratives, the identities, it underpins the emotions, it underpins the blind spots also around these issues that necessarily must be addressed It's not just about changing laws here or there or another policy or whatever. There are human stories, there are human communities, there are wrongs to be acknowledged, there are also shames to be acknowledged. And all of that taps into the sensitivities, the vulnerabilities, the defense mechanisms, the resistance points of trying to engage deeply and meaningfully in transforming unjust systems. The resistance points are almost always an indicator of unaddressed trauma dynamics. I don't want to touch it. I don't want to talk about it. This is too painful. This is too difficult. There's no band-aid that can fix the harm that was done. So that unpacking the relationship between collective and historical trauma and wider systemic injustices and the work that needs to be done to create collective cultural structural transformation necessarily taps into this lens, this trauma-informed lens. Coming to this last question that Celine raised, not everybody has signed up to have an explicit conversation around trauma. That itself is a sensitive topic to address. And that is precisely why Cordula and I articulated what we call the trauma awareness and engagement spectrum, which shows different degrees of indirectness and directness that organizations and practitioners and communities can use to engage with these topics. So sometimes we're talking about livelihoods. We're not talking about trauma. But when we talk about livelihoods, we might tap into inequalities in society that date back to collective injustices over several generations that relate to intergenerational cycles of poverty and violence that take a whole host of forms. So when we're talking about livelihoods, how do we prepare ourselves as practitioners, as participants, to be sensitive to the sensitivities around these topics and to unpack indirectly, and sometimes if the occasion and process allows, to unpack even explicitly how this taps into those other dimensions. And it's in creating those trauma-aware, trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and ultimately trauma-transformative and healing-centered spaces that we can get into those deeper issues. So you'll see, for example, in one chapter on working with youth in Kenya, that there are an interaction between structural and political dimensions of youth engagement and transformation in society that are trauma-informed and trauma-responsive, but perhaps are maybe unpacking in a different way than in another context where it's much more on the mental health experience of people who are living currently in or just coming out of a war scenario. So you'll find in several of these chapters direct and indirect facilitation techniques, methodologies through options, for example, like playback theater, where communities are able to define to what extent they want to enter into those topics in a way which has been facilitated by a wider process. And there are also reflection tools for organizations, critical reflection tools. How are we engaging with this? How are we taking care of our own staff? How are we integrating a trauma informed lens while we're doing a conflict analysis, while we're developing our human resources policy, etc. So that's a few words from me. Imke, I see that you have also a contribution to make. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and to all of you for the questions. And I'll just add a little bit of field perspective to what you just said, Sarah, starting with the questions by Sarah about the depolarization. And in my work, it's very visible that trauma is just being stuck, in most cases, on fight-flight. In some cases on freeze, but I'm going to talk about the fight-flight cases because this is the depolarization thing. So when you're in fight-flight, it's all about black and white, friend and foe. So people we have in peace building are very much in this black and white thinking. And when we work with them, the nuances are coming back in. And this is exactly what I think we need also on a political stage, because I don't see much difference. I see people who are in fight flight and who lack safety so badly that they choose power to compensate for that. And this is what I see in peace building. This is what I see in the news. So I think we're doing the same work. If they would let us work with politicians more, would probably have a great effect. And very shortly to Sandra's question, in communities that have not been in touch with MHPSS before, the biggest problem is usually a huge stigma. People are really, like Sarah said, people are afraid. There's a lot of stigma, especially around men. So big problem, especially to work with veterans, for example. Everyone knows that. So what I find most successful is a periphery to center approach, where you first work with the people who are really interested, then like with the people who are, like, for example, in Ukraine, we work first with people who are really interested to accompanying veterans in reintegration. And then from then we take another step to the families who become interested. And then we take another step. And at some point we are in the center where we are really working with the veterans themselves. And that works much better than the other way around. The problem is just that it's a bit difficult to explain that to donors sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Imke. So maybe I can nicely follow up on that. Thank you, first of all, Celine, Sarah, and Sandra, for these very important questions. First of all, maybe regarding depolarization, Imke has already referred to fight and flight. And of course, we also have other responses, like, for instance, freeze, namely that people are not engaging anymore. That they're basically saying, what can we do? It's not in our hands. Politicians are lying anyway. I'm not listening to news anymore. I'm withdrawing completely. And I would like maybe to very briefly share the experience I made with my dear friend Claudia. We actually had a project, exactly, Sarah, on depolarization in Switzerland. And we learned there a couple of lessons, particularly also from a trauma-sensitive perspective. And maybe the two ones which are maybe most relevant here are the following ones. If people do not feel safe, and it doesn't matter what we maybe define as safety, if people are not feeling safe, they will not engage generally, openly in any kind of dialogue. They know the rules of the game, they know what to say, but they basically pay lip service to some of the catchwords which they have to use. But people have to feel safe, that they are really willing to open up. And that is a question of time. This is a question of a certain humility. There's a question of maybe also having some uncomfortable conversations around what they consider their reality or their truth. So I think this question of safety and security is absolutely, I would say, the top number one condition, and that can take time before you can actually do any kind of maybe more substantial work. So that's one thing I would like to share. And the other one is, it sounds maybe quite banal, but I again learned the power of storytelling and connection. So many people, especially in this day and age of polarization, are so desperate to hear, to get their grievances out, to have other people listening to their grievances, to feel that they are listened to, that they are heard, that people recognize their struggle, their grievances. And I therefore very much would like to also share with you the power basically of storytelling and making that an integral part also of our peace building work. And again, that takes time, that people are willing to tell their story. But we had, for instance, just to give you the idea of Switzerland, people with a migration refugee background, people with disabilities, youngsters who never in their whole life shared their life story with anyone. And it was the first time that they were saying, and now I'm willing to talk. And this can have such a liberating effect, that can have such a empowering effect, which I would like also to maybe stress when it comes to depolarization. Sandra, thank you. Very big question, but to keep it very simple and to make it a bit maybe even more hands-on, I think any technique which helps to self-regulate, in other words, to really feel I'm connecting to my body, that can be breathing exercises, tapping exercises. I know, Sandra, you're also big into dancing. Anything which allows us to feel our beautiful bodies and to feel connected with our body, connected to our breathing, anything which helps to regulate the stress, the struggles, and so on, is, I think, an important, again, first step. Of course, that's not enough, but I think it speaks to me to the importance and the relevance of embodied approaches. And I think our book is full of different examples how to use art-based approaches, playback theater, dancing, and so on, in concrete terms when it comes to dealing with stress and trauma. And Celine, thank you for your question. I think for me here the question is also, is trauma always the right word to be used? Why do I say that? I think some of us have already touched on this question of trauma is still considered very, very much a social taboo. And people don't want to be seen vulnerable. So I think we also have to be there very strategic. What terms maybe serve the purpose? In other words, if people do not feel comfortable with using the term, then I usually ask people, what is the term you prefer? For instance, we can talk about collective trauma by not naming it. We can talk about the collective narratives which are disempowering, which are harmful. We can talk about the collective mindsets. The world is a dangerous place out there, again, without calling it trauma. And we can also talk about collective emotions such as fear, anxiety, and so on, hatred, without calling it trauma. So I would be there also very strategic, depending on who is in the room. Is it strategic to play the trauma card, so to say? Or do we want to be a bit more careful, knowing also maybe the cultural specific ramifications of using the term, and see what the people we're working with, the people who we actually do the work for, what is the terminology they prefer? In my humble own experience, people, if you again give them time to understand what we actually mean by these terms and have a very open conversation, which is also open for self-criticism and critical unpacking, people are willing to take up this terminology because they find it useful. They can say, now I understand what's going on in my family. Now I understand my own bodily reaction. Now I understand why we have the politicians we're having. Now I understand why certain conflict dynamics are so protracted. Sorry, that was a little bit of a longer answer, especially looking at the time. Sarah, we have 2 minutes.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So because we're wrapping up quite quickly, I put a couple of links in the chat for you on how you can access the volume. The first link, of course, gives the information about the book and where and how to order it if you're ordering either as an individual or as an institution. There is a discount code which we have offered, which can be used also by institutions and individuals. You can see that the volume is expensive, and we have suffered over that. We didn't realize the publisher gave us that price much later, and it is a large volume. So there are reasons why there is a high price, but we also have discussed at length how this creates accessibility problems. And of course, we are ourselves in favor of maximum accessibility. So 2 things for you. Number 1, there's the discount code. Number 2, we have procured a free sample, if you would, from the book, which goes more deeply into what is covered from the publisher. Thirdly, those who have institutional affiliations, academic institutional affiliations, hopefully your universities or research institutions will have an institutional affiliation to new publications, which may include Routledge books. Please do check. And if you find that there is an institutional access, once the book is published in about 2 weeks' time, that's wonderful, because then there is wide access for all people who have the academic affiliation. If your institution does not have an institutional purchase, please lobby that they make one, because it's much more practical to have access for whole institutional networks than for one individual copy. That would be for ebook and possibly even a library copy. Thirdly, on open access, we are actively trying to crowdfund funding for open access to enable the volume to be freely accessible for the entire world without any restriction. If you have ideas, if you're willing to support with some funding from your institution or personally, please be in touch with us, because we would like to make the volume open access. Finally, the discount code cannot be accessed. All right, I will try to find a way for it to be, request access to the code in the GDoc. All right, I'll find a way to resolve that problem, and we will, unless Cordula, you're able to put the discount banner directly into the chat, that would be great. One of the things I just wanted to tag on to the end is that this volume helps people to read the room. It gives an indication of indicators. What are the signs that individual and or collective trauma might be intervening in the space? How do you see it? It's not always named, as Cordula mentioned. It comes through subtle indicators, behaviors, body language. It comes in discrete ways. We first need to educate ourselves to recognize trauma at the individual and collective and structural levels. That's the first thing, is the awareness. The other is, how do we monitor, or how do we recognize processes of healing and resilience? Also having that lens. What are we watching for as signs that broken parts are mending, that walls are coming down? How do we track collective healing processes and create enabling spaces for them? So those are some of the other things that come through the volume that maybe we hadn't mentioned yet. A lot of practical tools. Did we resolve the discount one or not? Anyway, the third link is the free chapter. Great to meet you. I'll just check in with Cordula. We are available to you. Stephen has raised his hand. Please do reach out to us by email. Please do be in touch with us. Our chapter contributors are happy and waiting to talk more about the work that they're doing, to join in opportunities to collaborate on other types of events, even projects. Please consider the entire collection, ourselves included, as an open invitation to carry the conversation forward. We are confident that this volume has done a lot to map where this conversation has come to and where it needs to go. But of course, work is being done by wonderful people and organizations every day of the week. There are a lot of other wonderful contributions that are being made. Please do share with us as well. We would love to see your work in this area and to support each other in this wider conversation going forward. Cordula, over to you. And then I guess we've come to the end of our session. Oh, Stephen first. Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, just to echo what Sarah said, I'm guessing there's many participants here who would enjoy hosting even something in their organization. And so we're part of working with crowdsourcing to make this open access, maybe over the next year or so. And so we've often thought about maybe just doing section by section. But if there's a particular element of a thematic element of the book that your organization would like to invite contributors to, reach out to Sarah and Cordula in that space. It's been a lot of work, so we would love to run the PR wagon as long as we can in this sort of environment that we're in today.
Thank you, Stephen. And as you already said, trauma sensitivity is all about creating safety, security, and connection. And that's what we try to do a little bit also with this book launch, for being connected with all of you. And as a way of maybe concluding, Sarah and I would like to invite you to all unmute yourself and to say goodbye in your mother or father tongue. Tschö. Tschüss, tschüss.
Tschüss.
Veel dank.
Bye.
Arrivederci.
Enrico.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Masalama. You said goodbye in your language. Masalama. Masalama.
Tschüss.
Tschüss, Angela. Tschüss, everyone. Thank you so much, Faherini.
Right.
Wonderful that you could all came. Ciao, ciao.
Hi,
Ciao.
Cordula.
Good to see you. Very happy to see you. Hi, hi.
Good to see
After
you.
such a long time. Wonderful.
Yes, I came down to Switzerland, Geneva, and I couldn't get across to you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
I'm afraid
bye-bye.
I have to go. All the best. And
Yeah.
thank you again, all of you, for coming. Bye-bye. Bye.